Early on the morning of August 19th, 1991, a 32-year-old man named Bobby Curley stood in his recently renovated kitchen in the city of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. He walked over to his fridge, opened it up, reached inside, and grabbed his bag lunch along with his thermos, and he was just about to head out the door and go to work, but he stopped and gave his wife Joanne a kiss on the cheek and said he loved her, and then he left for the day. So Bobby and Joanne had been married for a year, and they lived with Joanne's 4-year-old daughter, Angela, in a duplex in a working-class neighborhood. Bobby was an electrician, and so he made pretty good money, but the Curleys were by no means rich. However, Bobby knew that actually might change soon, because Joanne was on the verge of winning this big court settlement. Joanne had actually been married once before, but her husband had died in a car accident about 3 years ago. His car had collided with a tractor trailer, and the driver of that tractor trailer was eventually found to be the one at fault. And so now, Joanne's lawyers and the trucking company's lawyers were finally closing in on a financial settlement to compensate Joanne for her first husband's wrongful death. It had been a really stressful process, and Bobby had definitely noticed that Joanne had been more sullen and stressed than usual as they were going through it. But now that the case was finally wrapping up, Joanne did appear to be sort of back in good spirits. And, while nothing was official yet, it looked like they were going to receive approximately $1 million in compensation, which was obviously really exciting. In fact, the two of them were already mapping out how they might spend some of this money. Some of the ideas they had come up with included taking Angela on a few big trips, and also maybe using some of that money to finally fund Bobby having his own business, something he had always wanted to do, but lacked the resources for. But for now, the settlement was not complete, and so Bobby had to go to his normal 9-to-5 and, punch the clock and keep earning money for the family. So for today, once he was outside, he simply got into his car and made the short drive to his current job site. 10 minutes later, Bobby parked outside of a science building on the campus of Wilkes University, which was a small college in Wilkes-Barre. He saw some of the guys on his crew standing out front, waiting to be let into this building. So Bobby, who was the foreman of their crew, he got out of his car and said good morning to everyone and then walked up and unlocked the doors. Then they all went inside and got to work. And working at this location had really become a pretty big routine for this group, because by now Bobby and his crew had been coming here, working here for a few months now. And this job was a really big job. Bobby and his team were helping renovate the entire building, which included all the classrooms, all the laboratories, hallways, everything. And so they still had quite a bit of work to do. But there was another reason this job was taking as long as it was. And that was because when Bobby's crew had first shown up at the building, they had expected it to be totally prepared for them, meaning all furniture and equipment would be cleared out. But instead, they found a ton of stuff just kind of everywhere inside the building, because the building clearly had not been prepped at all. The chemistry lab, for example, still had random flasks and chemical bottles and, wet rags with weird substances on them just laying around the room. So as a result, Bobby and his crew had been forced to do a ton of cleanup, before they even got into their jobs that they had not planned on, and it really set them back. And so now, just to stay on schedule, they were regularly putting in 12-hour days basically every day they were there. And so all these extra hours had Bobby feeling completely exhausted, and lately, he had sort of felt kind of sick almost, and he just sort of chalked that up to basically overworking. But Bobby never complained. The overtime pay was great, and he really enjoyed working with these particular guys on this crew. These guys were basically his friends. So normally, the long work days were actually kind of fun, as exhausting and awful as they were. Later that afternoon, Bobby was standing on a ladder inside of that chemistry lab, running electrical wires above the ceiling panels. And as he was doing that, he suddenly heard this loud commotion coming from across the room. Bobby realized what he was hearing were guys on his crew basically shouting and laughing. So he climbed down to see what was going on. And when he walked over there, he saw that everybody was gathered around one of the members of the crew, whose name was Sammy DePasquale. And Sammy was sort of doubled over, coughing and spitting and holding a Coke can in his hand. Another member of the crew, whose name was Robert Marconi, explained to Bobby when he walked over that somebody had swapped out Sammy's Coke with a different Coke can, one that was filled with chewing tobacco spit instead of soda. Bobby cringed. This was absolutely disgusting. Even as a prank, this was awful. But it was also sort of par for the course for the guys on Bobby's crew. This is sort of what they did. They were always playing pranks on each other to kind of lighten the mood on long work days like today. And everybody was laughing, even Sammy, who'd been the butt of the joke. And so eventually, Bobby joined in too. He thought that this was ultimately good for morale, as gross as it was. And after a minute or so, Sammy recovered from his coughing fit from drinking this disgusting liquid and vowed sort of comically to get payback on whoever switched his Coke can. Then after that, all the guys got back to work. And so Bobby, he left the group and went back over to his ladder. And as he was climbing back up, he paused about halfway because he felt this sudden wave of sickness come over him. It almost felt like he had a flu coming on, which didn't really surprise him because he had been doing all these overtime hours and he really had felt run down as a result of it. And so again, he's just sort of chalking up the way he feels to overworking. And so as Bobby is standing on this ladder, he kind of told himself, just suck it up, this will pass. And he just stood there on the ladder. And after a minute or two, that sensation of being sick did sort of pass. And then, because he was not a complainer, he was a hardworking guy, he just pushed the sickness feeling he was having out of his mind. He climbed back up and got back to doing his wiring. But 4 days later, on the morning of Friday, August 23rd, Bobby felt worse than ever. As he made his way across the college parking lot towards the science building where his crew was still working, he felt like his feet were heavy and he was constantly short of breath. And then as the workday went on, continuing to run wires in that chem lab, Bobby got really sweaty and really hot. His coworkers noticed and kept coming up to him to ask if he needed to go home early. But even though Bobby totally did need to go home early and felt awful, he would just tell them, nope, he was just fine. And so Bobby would manage to get through that particular workday. But then at the end of the day, when it was time to go home, Bobby felt so relieved. He could not wait to just get home, crawl into bed, and sleep. But by the next morning, Saturday morning, that heavy feeling in Bobby's feet had turned into this really intense burning pain that actually went all the way up his legs. And then his hands went numb. At this point, Bobby had to admit to himself that this was not a symptom of overworking. He was sick, like something was wrong with him. So he went to his doctor. But the doctor told him that despite what he was feeling, the symptoms were not that serious. Like it didn't appear that something was seriously wrong with him. And so ultimately, he just told Bobby to, go home and get more rest. That's what you need right now. So that's exactly what Bobby did. For the rest of that Saturday and all day the next day, Sunday, Bobby didn't do anything except lay in bed. But by that Sunday evening, Bobby still felt horrible. So he picked up the phone and did something that Bobby basically never did. He called one of his coworkers and told them that unfortunately, he would not be able to come to work tomorrow. When Bobby woke up the next morning, on Monday morning, the day he had taken off from work, he was in so much pain that he couldn't even stand up on his own. His wife, Joanne, tried to help him get out of bed and go to the bathroom, but he was physically too heavy for her to lift. And so Joanne actually ended up calling Bobby's brother, David, to come over the house and help. But even with David there, who could now basically help move Bobby around the house, it was very clear to Bobby that whatever was happening to him was not some minor issue. Like this was serious. And it clearly was not going away with rest, like the doctor had said it would. And so at some point that day, the family called an ambulance, which came and took Bobby to a nearby hospital. But by the time they got there, the pain in Bobby's legs had gotten so bad that Bobby was literally periodically screaming in pain. And he also had begun to vomit. But after several hours of nonstop pain and nonstop testing at the hospital doctors came into Bobby's room and they told him and his family that they actually had good news. They knew what was wrong with Bobby, and it was treatable. They diagnosed him with something called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a condition where the body's immune system attacks the nerves and causes tingling in the feet and hands. But the staff assured Bobby that all he needed was a very specific medication, and then he would feel a whole lot better. Bobby was incredibly relieved, as was his family, and that day he began taking the medication, and quickly his pain became tolerable, he stopped vomiting, and before long, he actually felt good enough that he was able to go home. It seemed like Bobby had really turned a corner here, and that everything really was going to be okay. But within just a few days of being back home again, Bobby's pain came back even worse than before, despite still taking this medication. And he also began experiencing a new symptom. His hair started falling out. On September 7th, so now a week and a half after Bobby came back from the hospital, well, he was back there again. And to Bobby's horror, this time, his doctors actually seemed kind of baffled by his symptoms. They told him that sudden extreme hair loss was definitely not a symptom of Guillain-Barré syndrome. So they told Bobby that it seemed like their initial diagnosis must have been wrong, despite the fact that the medication they gave him to treat GBS had helped him for a little while. And so the problem now was the doctors were basically at a total loss as to how to help Bobby. They really didn't know what was going on. And so for the next 9 days, doctors ran test after test on Bobby, and all the while, Bobby's pain intensified so much and became so constant that he basically fell into this almost delirious state, like the pain was completely too much. And then eventually, all these doctors who ran all these tests came back to Bobby and his family, and they just told them that we don't know what's wrong. Like, all these tests did not provide any clarity, and so basically we can't help you. And they told Bobby that now the only choice was he needed to be transferred to a bigger, more specialized medical facility in Hershey, Pennsylvania, which was about 100 miles away from Wilkes-Barre. A few days later, a neurologist named Dr. Robert Brennan walked down the hallway of the bigger hospital in Hershey, Pennsylvania. He was heading to the room where his patient, Bobby Curley, was staying. And even from several yards down the hallway, Dr. Brennan could already hear Bobby screaming and cursing at the nurses. Ever since Bobby had arrived at this hospital, his behavior had gotten more and more unhinged. At one point, Bobby had even thrown medical equipment across the room. And so now Dr. Brennan had to keep Bobby physically restrained to his bed. And so Dr. Brennan, when he reached Bobby's room, took a deep breath out in the hallway, and then into the room he walked. And inside, he saw Bobby strapped down to the bed, and he was screaming and thrashing around violently. And Dr. Brennan found himself just feeling awful about it. I mean, he felt really bad for Bobby. But really, he didn't know what to do for Bobby. He and his staff had tried basically everything they could think of to try to treat Bobby's pain, but nothing had worked. And so, on this day, Dr. Brennan couldn't do anything except what he normally did, which was just stand in Bobby's room sort of helplessly as Bobby screamed and flailed in pain. But on September 22nd, so 6 days after Bobby arrived in Hershey, he finally fell silent, because on that day, he slipped into a coma. 3 days later, Dr. Brennan felt very defeated as he stepped into Bobby's hospital room. There, he saw 5 members of Bobby's family: his wife Joanne, his 4-year-old stepdaughter Angela, Bobby's adult siblings Susan and David, and Bobby's elderly mother Mary. They'd all come to be with Bobby after he had fallen into this coma. Now, they looked up at Dr. Brennan expectantly. And Dr. Brennan, he took a deep breath, and he said he had some bad news. New test results had come back, and now, based on those results, they knew what was wrong with Bobby. Dr. Brennan told the family that what Bobby was suffering from was something called thallium toxicity. And when he said this, Dr. Brennan watched the family for some kind of a reaction, but the family just stared blankly at him like they had no idea what that meant. So Dr. Brennan went on and explained that thallium is an extremely toxic chemical. In fact, it can kill anyone who touches it, ingests it, or even just inhales its fumes. And he told them that, this is really unusual because thallium is highly controlled in the United States. It's actually banned in household products. So this is not a chemical that, Bobby just could have accidentally stumbled upon. This is pretty rare. And so at this point, Dr. Brennan just paused and let the family sit with this new information. And the family, they looked at each other like, wow, this is awful, but nobody knew how to react. They just kind of looked back at the doctor, waiting for him to explain more. But when the doctor didn't say anything, Bobby's sister, Susan, just asked in a quavering voice, what can we do? At that point, Dr. Brennan just shook his head and said, unfortunately, there's no cure for thallium poisoning. 2 days later, on September 27th, Joanne stood next to her unconscious husband in the hospital, and she nodded at the medical staff that was gathered all around him. It was ultimately Joanne's decision whether or not to keep Bobby on life support. But with no hope of a cure, Joanne had ultimately decided that the best thing to do was to take him off life support. And so after giving the signal to medical staff, Joanne, her daughter, and the rest of Bobby's family, they kind of stepped back from the bed, and they watched as the staff walked over and removed Bobby's ventilator. And then Joanne had to watch as her husband took his final breath. On the evening of October 21st, 1991, so about a month after Bobby died from thallium poisoning, a police detective named Harold Cawley sat at a big table with 7 other men inside of a steakhouse in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. The other men were a mixture of coroners and investigators from all across Pennsylvania. Some were from the Hershey area, where Bobby had died. The rest, like Cawley, worked for the police in Wilkes-Barre, where Bobby had lived. The men were there discussing the investigation into Bobby's death, and they had been doing this for the past 3 hours already, because there really was so much to talk about. They had already covered Bobby's initial autopsy results, which showed that he had a staggering 900 times the lethal limit of thallium in his system when he died. And so they were working under the assumption that Bobby must have been poisoned by a single massive dose of thallium, whether accidentally or on purpose, they didn't know. And so they discussed theories for how this could have even happened to him. Because remember, thallium is not just a chemical you can get from the store. I mean, this is something that is highly regulated. So how did he come in contact with it? Their first thought had been basically what everybody else suspected, which was, Bobby must have been accidentally poisoned at the Wilkes University chemistry lab where he'd been working for so many months. And they actually had a bunch of records from a preliminary examination of the lab. And according to these records, one of the first things investigators had found inside of that lab was 5 vials of thallium in one of the storerooms. They'd also found a rag that was laying out on a countertop that presumably was there when Bobby first arrived and he and his crew began cleaning everything up. And next to this rag was a handwritten note that had a warning on it that literally said, "Thallium wiping rag, touch me and die." The rag had actually caused a huge amount of panic amongst the investigators when they had gone in to begin sweeping the lab for signs of thallium, because people were fearful that maybe they'd brushed up against it and touched this rag, and were they going to get thallium poisoning? However, they actually tested the rag and it came back negative for thallium, as did all the surfaces in the lab and also the air in the lab. And so the investigators had finally decided that that note must have been a joke or something. Also, the university insisted that all of its thallium was accounted for, meaning none of it could have been, stolen or misused in some way to poison Bobby because they would know about it. And so at this point, the university had actually been sort of ruled out as where Bobby got poisoned, which really didn't make sense to Detective Cawley or the other investigators at this dinner, because again, thallium is hard to come by. The idea that Bobby was working in a lab that contained thallium, but that wasn't where he was poisoned by thallium, seemed almost impossible. It had to have happened there. But they had gone out and tested all of Bobby's coworkers who had also worked in that lab with Bobby for so many days and so many hours, and they all came back negative for thallium exposure. However, Bobby's own family, his wife Joanne and her 4-year-old daughter Angela, they had tested positive for thallium exposure. Granted, it was on a near microscopic level because any amount of exposure could actually be lethal, and those two were okay, so obviously they had not received a lethal dose. But there were very small traces of thallium in both of them, which was odd. And so everybody at the table agreed that the right thing to do here was to speak to Joanne and see if maybe she had some ideas of how she and her daughter and obviously Bobby could have maybe come in contact with this very rare and lethal chemical. And then also, they need to get inside of the family's duplex to search it, literally, for thallium. But first, there was the problem of jurisdiction. Bobby had died in Hershey, but he'd gotten sick in Wilkes-Barre. So, after some discussion, the men decided that the Wilkes-Barre police should be the ones to head up the case because that is where Bobby actually got poisoned. The next day, Detective Cawley invited Bobby's siblings, David and Suzanne, to the Wilkes-Barre police station. And right away, it was quite clear that both of them were very suspicious of Bobby's wife, Joanne. They told Cawley that Joanne had been acting really strange for months, both before and also after Bobby's death. David said when his brother had first gotten sick, Joanne had barely lifted a finger to help him. She'd called David to come over and look after Bobby, acting like she needed somebody strong enough to move Bobby around, which was true. But while David was upstairs literally carrying Bobby to and from the bathroom, Joanne stayed downstairs with her daughter and totally ignored them. She didn't even pretend to want to help. She basically let David do all of it. And Susan said, even though she didn't know for sure, her impression of Joanne right after she had taken Bobby off life support and he's died, her impression of Joanne was she was hugely relieved. Cawley listened and nodded and sort of gave the impression that he was following along and basically believed them. But inside, he wasn't really convinced that what they were describing was highly suspicious behavior. When David came over to help Bobby, that was because she had asked him to do that, after trying at first, unsuccessfully, to move her husband around. And then when David was there, she does have a 4-year-old daughter. She can't just leave her unsupervised. Or maybe she doesn't want her daughter to see Bobby, and so she has to keep her downstairs. So there's an explanation for that. And as for Joanne being relieved after her husband's death, everybody dealt with grief differently. And Bobby's death had been a really traumatic, drawn-out process for everybody involved. So maybe she was relieved, but not because she was happy about it. It could have just been the end of a nightmare chapter in all of their lives. And so after he had listened to their concerns, Cawley began to redirect the conversation, and he began asking David and Susan about their relationship with Bobby. They both said they were very close with their brother, even as adults. They said they lived nearby, and they saw each other quite a bit. David in particular said he spent a lot of time with Bobby. He said they often went fishing, and recently, together, they had renovated Bobby's kitchen. And this caught Cawley's attention, because it sounded like David and Bobby had finished this renovation project around the same time that Bobby first got sick. Cawley didn't know if this was relevant or not, but it was interesting. So at the end of their discussion, he just thanked David and Susan for all the information and told them they were free to go. A few days later, on the morning of October 25th, 1991, Detective Cawley and 3 other investigators sat at an interrogation table in the Wilkes-Barre police station, right across from Joanne Curley, and the lawyer that she had brought along with her. Cawley didn't know what to make of Joanne yet. Obviously, she and her daughter had also been exposed to thallium, so that could mean that they too accidentally were exposed to this chemical, same as Bobby, but obviously on a much smaller scale because they lived. Or they could have also been the target of somebody trying to poison this family, and ultimately just Bobby was killed from this poisoning. Or Joanne could be the poisoner. She could have poisoned her own husband. Bobby's siblings are talking about how awful Joanne was acting towards her husband in the wake of his illness. Maybe she poisoned him. And in doing so, she accidentally exposed herself and her daughter. Basically, Cawley couldn't tell yet if Joanne was a victim or a perpetrator. So he made sure to watch her very carefully while another investigator began asking her to explain how and when her husband first got sick. Joanne said that Bobby had been complaining about feeling pretty run down for what felt like weeks or maybe even months. But he hadn't had any major symptoms until a week before his hospitalization in August. And she said that much like Bobby, she had just kind of chalked it up to he had been overworking, or maybe he had some standard illness that would just go away with rest, like that first doctor had said. She said that she had never even heard of thallium, and really at no point had it ever crossed her mind that maybe Bobby had been poisoned by thallium. As Cawley listened to Joanne tell this story, he was struck by a couple of things. First of all, Joanne said Bobby had been feeling pretty run down for a while before his death. This seemed to conflict with investigators' assumption that a single massive dose of thallium had sent Bobby to the hospital and ultimately killed him. It seemed more likely, based on what Joanne said, that this poisoning happened over a period of time. And the second thing Cawley was struck by was actually just Joanne's general demeanor. She had just recounted in detail, the story of her husband dying, this awful, awful death. Thallium poisoning is a horrible way to die. And as she's describing it, she's not shedding a single tear or really acting at all like she's even upset about it. And so at this point, Colley was beginning to wonder if maybe Susan and David had been right about Joanne. She really did not seem to care much about her husband's death. And so what Colley did is he stopped the other investigator and he leaned forward and he just asked Joanne point blank, how do you explain how you and your daughter were exposed to thallium? And immediately, Joanne had a story, a bizarre one. She said Bobby really liked to drink iced tea when he was at work. So every morning, she would fill his thermos up from this big pitcher of pre-made iced tea that she kept in their fridge. And so Bobby would take that thermos with him to work and he would drink the tea all day and then come home with the thermos. And some days when he would come back, Bobby had not drank all the iced tea. There'd be some left inside the thermos. And so Joanne said what she would do in that case was she would take the remaining iced tea still in the thermos and she would pour it back into the pitcher in the fridge, basically to salvage what was left of the tea. And she said she and her daughter also drank from that pitcher. So in essence, she sometimes was drinking from the same tea that Bobby was drinking from directly. And so perhaps in that way, if he was being exposed to thallium, maybe it was getting into that tea that he was bringing home. And, she believed that maybe that was how she was being exposed, by drinking the leftover iced tea. Colley glanced over at the other investigators in the room, and they all looked as baffled as he was. This iced tea explanation was pretty out there, but it was so weirdly specific that they really couldn't write it off. And Colley knew that, if the iced tea theory was legitimate, it might be able to explain why all three people in this family, all living in the same place, had such drastically different levels of exposure. Basically, Bobby could be having this huge exposure to thallium outside the house, and then basically remnants of the thallium exposure are finding their way back into that leftover tea, so it's a really small amount of thallium. That's coming back home, it's being mixed inside that pitcher, and so when Joanne and her daughter are drinking from that pitcher, they're only getting a very small amount of thallium. And so again, it's out there, but it would explain it. So Colley asked Joanne if he had her permission to not just search her whole duplex to check for thallium, but specifically check her fridge, check her pitcher, her iced tea pitcher, and all the thermoses that Bobby brought to work to see if there was still trace levels of thallium inside of them. And he was worried when he asked her this question that she might refuse or give some reason that she couldn't, but Joanne immediately agreed without any hesitation. That same afternoon, Colley, his investigators, and a crime scene unit arrived at the Curleys' duplex to begin their search. Colley looked on as the crime scene unit entered the duplex and immediately began scouring every surface. And they found absolutely no trace of thallium anywhere in the house, except for in one very specific location. The thermos Joanne had already told them about, the one that Bobby would bring with the iced tea in it to work and then back again. Traces of thallium were found on the little ridges at the top of the thermos where the lid screwed back on. And this was huge, not only because now they had the first clear sign of exactly where the thallium was coming in and out of Bobby's life, but more specifically because it was at the top of this cup that obviously Bobby is drinking from. This showed that the way the thallium wound up in Bobby's system was because he ingested it. That was something they didn't know at this point. Now it seems very clear that's how it happened. But despite this revelation, it didn't explain how Joanne and Angela were also exposed, because when they tested the big pitcher of iced tea in the fridge, it didn't contain any thallium. And also, just finding the thallium at the top of the thermos didn't explain how it actually got there. But for Colley, what really stood out about finding thallium on this thermos was that this item, this thermos, is something Bobby took to work and home every single day. So it seemed like maybe, Colley and his staff had been too quick to rule out where Bobby was working. I mean, he was working in a chemical lab that contained thallium, and they had ruled that out as the place where he could have been poisoned. Now, it seemed like they needed to take another look. 7 months later, in late May of 1992, Detective Cawley sat at his desk, thumbing through the notes from all the interviews and polygraph tests that he and his team had carried out since the previous October. One by one, they had brought in all of Bobby's coworkers and grilled them about Bobby's death. And all of the coworkers had more or less said the same thing. Bobby was well-liked, and nobody they knew would want to harm him. Some of the coworkers did admit that they did like to prank each other a lot, but they said the pranks had always been, pretty harmless, and spiking somebody's drinks with chemicals was way, way beyond anything they ever did. At least, that's what all of them said. But 2 of Bobby's coworkers, Sammy DePasquale and Robert Marconi, had failed their polygraph exams. In fact, the polygraph examiner said those 2 had literally gotten the worst scores he had ever seen. So very quickly, those 2 shot to the top of Cawley's suspect list. And so Cawley had pressed both of them about whether or not they had pranked Bobby by putting thallium into his thermos. Maybe they didn't know how dangerous thallium was, but did they put something in his thermos? And they said absolutely not, they didn't do that. But Cawley didn't believe them, because he'd already heard about previous pranks that involved swapping out coworkers' drinks for things like tobacco spit. So what's to say they didn't put thallium in Bobby's thermos? It just sort of tracked. The problem was, Cawley didn't have any actual evidence that he could use to arrest either of them, especially since the university continued to insist that none of their thallium was missing from the lab. Now, Cawley knew it was possible the university was wrong, that maybe there was unaccounted for thallium, but he had no way to prove that. Cawley also felt pretty suspicious of Joanne and also Bobby's own brother, David. Joanne, for obvious reasons, was still suspicious. She had thallium in her system. She seemed oddly detached from Bobby when he was dying, kind of letting other people take care of him, and apparently was relieved when he was taken off life support. But even if Joanne had wanted to poison Bobby, it was really unclear how she would have gotten her hands on thallium. And then as for David, the reason he was sort of suspicious to Cawley is because he spent a lot of time with Bobby. And he also did that kitchen renovation with him. And so there's all these moments where he's alone, potentially handling chemicals with Bobby before he got sick. So basically, David had the opportunity to poison Bobby, but there really was no motive. And just like with Joanne, Cawley felt like, where would David get the thallium? That was the big question. Where is the thallium coming from? And so at this point, Detective Cawley was basically at a dead end and just did not know how to take this case. Which was heartbreaking because earlier that day, he'd been informed that the district attorney had decided to actually shut down the investigation into Bobby's death. The case was officially cold. And so since Cawley could not revive it, all he could do was close the case file and stick it in a drawer. One morning in August of 1994, so more than 2 years after the investigation into Bobby's death was shut down, Detective Cawley walked up the porch steps of the duplex where Bobby had lived, and he knocked on the door. Cawley had been thinking a lot about this case recently, and today he was hoping that Bobby's widow, Joanne, would help him take one last shot at cracking it. A moment later, Joanne answered the door, and once the look of surprise left her face, she invited the detective inside. Cawley quickly explained to her that the reason he was here is because there had been this technological breakthrough in toxicology testing. The Wilkes-Barre police were now able to perform a new type of test that had not been available to them 3 years ago when her husband had died. And Cawley believed that, this information they could get would help them figure out what actually happened to Bobby once and for all. Joanne's eyes lit up at this news, and she was about to open her mouth to reply, but Cawley quickly added there was actually a catch. He said in order to do these tests, they would have to exhume Bobby's body. And the only person who could give investigators permission to do that was Joanne. Cawley waited while Joanne processed everything she had just been told. He tried not to let it show on his face, but Joanne's response to this would basically decide the entire fate of this case. If she said no, there really was nothing they could do. The evidence contained inside of Bobby's casket would be lost to them forever, which meant if somebody had intentionally poisoned Bobby, they would never figure out who it was, and so the killer would never be brought to justice. But unsurprisingly, Joanne said yes, of course. Later that month, on August 23rd, Cawley went to the cemetery where Bobby was buried, and he watched as a backhoe dug up his grave and pulled his casket out of the ground. The police and coroner then took custody of Bobby's body, and they would go on to perform these new toxicology tests. And when the results came in, they gave Cawley the exact information he had hoped for. Based on the police investigation, and critically, those new toxicology tests, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Bobby Curley. The first time the killer slipped thallium into Bobby's thermos, Bobby was busy working in another room and didn't notice, which was exactly what the killer wanted. The killer did not hate Bobby. In fact, they really hadn't wanted to kill him until he had started talking about opening up his own business with that settlement money his family was going to get. And the killer just could not let that happen. Because if Bobby went into business for himself, he would ruin everything. The killer believed that by poisoning Bobby one time, that would kill him, and then all their problems would be solved. But the next day, Bobby actually seemed fine, sort of unfazed by the poison. So the next time the killer got the chance, they added a little more poison to Bobby's thermos. And when Bobby again stayed healthy the next day, well, the killer just added a little bit more the next time, and they just kept on doing that. They were afraid that if they added too much at once, Bobby might notice, and then they would get caught. So, for months, Bobby was being poisoned, but didn't really show any significant symptoms. But finally, in August of 1991, Bobby started showing really severe symptoms. Remember, his legs were in extreme pain, his hands were going numb, and when he called in sick to work on that Monday, that was when the killer knew they were certain they had finished him off. Except they hadn't finished him off. Because when he went to the hospital, Bobby just continued to cling to life. So the killer actually went to visit Bobby in the hospital. And while Bobby was sleeping, the killer slipped a final, massive amount of the poison into a soda cup that Bobby kept by his bedside. And when Bobby woke up, the killer kind of casually encouraged him to drink the soda. And Bobby did so without any hesitation because Bobby had no reason not to trust the killer. Because the killer was his own wife, Joanne Curley. She had actually started poisoning him almost a year before she actually murdered him. But investigators didn't realize this until a new type of toxicology test allowed them to figure out exactly when Bobby was being poisoned. This test worked by analyzing some of the hairs that Bobby still had left on his body. Basically, every time Bobby was poisoned, a chemical marker was left behind in his hair. So as his hair grew out, the strands sort of became timelines that showed exactly when he had been poisoned. And when Cawley, through these tests, discovered that Bobby had been poisoned multiple times between October 1990 and September of 1991, these dates ruled out Bobby's coworkers and his brother David. The poisoning had simply started too early for David to be responsible and went on far too long for his coworkers to be guilty. But the timeline clearly ruled in Joanne. And when police began digging into why Joanne might have wanted to kill her husband, they realized she'd convinced Bobby to make her the beneficiary of his life insurance policy just days before poisoning him for the very first time. And so Joanne's motive was money. She did not want Bobby to have any of that financial windfall she was going to get from the death of her earlier husband, the wrongful death lawsuit where she was going to get $1 million, even though she kind of acted like, oh yeah, Bobby's going to use some of that to start his business. She didn't want that. She did not want him to have any of it. That was her money. So that was one motivation financially, and the other financial motivation was by killing Bobby, she would also receive the life insurance payout. As for where Joanne actually got the thallium, she would admit that she had used an old container of rat poison that did contain thallium that was manufactured in the US before thallium was banned in household products. On December 12, 1996, 5 years after Bobby's death, Joanne was finally arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Joanne ultimately pled guilty and so was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. She would wind up serving all 20 years and was released from prison in 2016. At 6 p.m. on Friday, December 17, 2010, a 25-year-old woman named Jo Yates sat drinking and listening to Christmas music at the Bristol Ram pub with some of her coworkers in Bristol, England. Joe, who was a landscape architect, and her coworkers were regulars at this pub. But tonight, they were there specifically to celebrate an early Christmas together. Joe sipped her cider and looked out the window at the falling snow. The sun had just set, and the snowflakes seemed to glow under the streetlights. This, along with the holiday decorations on the shops outside, made the whole street look like the cover of a Christmas card. Joe looked away from the window and joined in on the conversation with her coworkers, who were talking about their various holiday plans. Joe said she was very excited because this was the first Christmas she was going to spend with her boyfriend, Greg Reardon. Greg had gone on a weekend trip, but when he got back, they were going to spend a week with their family and then travel, just the two of them, to Scotland for Hogmanay, which is like a Scottish New Year's celebration. As Joe spoke about Greg, she couldn't help but smile. A few years earlier, she'd been a university student just trying to figure out what she was going to do with her life. And now she had a great job, she had a perfect little flat, and the man that she loved, Greg, had recently started talking about getting married. Life was perfect. At about 8 p.m., so 2 hours after Joe had gotten to the pub, she wished all her coworkers a happy Christmas. She got up from the table, put on her long cream-colored coat, and headed outside into the snow. It was cold, about 27 degrees Fahrenheit, or almost -3 degrees Celsius, but Joe was used to the winter weather. She pulled her coat collar up around her neck and started walking home to her flat, which was about a 30-minute walk away. After walking for a while, Joe ducked into a convenience store to grab a frozen pizza, and then after that, she went into a small shop called Bargain Booze and bought 2 bottles of cider. And so now, with her food and drinks in hand, Joe continued the walk home. She knew her flat would feel empty without Greg there, but she was still looking forward to spending a relaxing Friday night with her cider and her pizza, and of course, her cat. A little after 8:45 p.m., Joe finally approached her flat, which was a basement unit in an old stone house. Joe and Greg's landlord, a retired English teacher, lived in the unit right above them. Joe unlocked the outside door that led directly into her flat, and then she walked inside and put her food and drinks on the kitchen counter. She took off her coat and hung it on a hook near the door, slipped off her boots, and then called for her cat. But after calling for him, she didn't hear him clacking across the hardwood floor like she expected. She looked all around the flat, but she couldn't find him anywhere. Joe shook her head and went back to the kitchen. Her and Greg's cat was a bit of an escape artist. He frequently got out. Their landlord had found their cat in his place upstairs several times, and also, the cat had even made it across the small front garden to their next-door neighbor's place before. And so Joe felt confident the cat would come home when he got too cold, and so for now, she just grabbed a cider, cracked it open, and sat down in the front room. And after she'd only taken a couple of sips, she heard a knock on the door. Joe hoped it was her landlord returning her cat, so she got out of her chair, opened the door, and when she saw who was there, she gave a huge smile. On the night of December 19th, so 2 days after Joe had met her coworkers at the pub, her boyfriend Greg got back to their flat after being gone for the weekend. He unlocked the flat door, walked inside, and put his bag down on the floor. He was about to call out for Joe, but he heard a strange sound coming from the kitchen. His and Joe's cat was meowing, but it sounded like the animal was afraid or angry. Greg walked into the kitchen, and he saw the cat pacing back and forth in front of an empty food bowl. This was really strange, because Joe always made sure that bowl was full. And so Greg scooped some cat food out of the bag, dumped it in the cat's bowl, and then walked to the bedroom looking for Joe. However, she wasn't there. Greg figured she must have gone out with friends or something. He had messaged her when he was heading home, and he hadn't heard back yet, but he really hadn't thought much about it. However, when he stepped back into the front room, he actually looked around for the first time, and at this point, he did start to get worried. Greg saw Joe's coat, her boots, and her purse right there in the room. He knew how cold it was, and so Joe would never have left, at least not without her coat, and she definitely would not leave her purse behind. Greg grabbed his phone and called Joe, and as he did, he suddenly felt a chill come over him, because he heard the sound of her phone ringing inside of her coat pocket right in front of him. Now, Greg started to panic. Jo was one of those people who never went anywhere without her phone. And so he immediately dialed 999, the emergency number in the UK, and he told the operator that his girlfriend, Jo Yates, was missing. In the early morning of December 20th, about 4 hours after Greg called 999, Detective Inspector Joe Goff of the Avon and Somerset Police walked into the flat. D.I. Goff had been a police officer for over 20 years, and as such, he'd learned to remain even-keeled in almost every situation. He spoke in a soft, low voice, and the look on his face almost never gave anything away. Goff greeted a few uniformed officers who had arrived before him and walked over to Greg, who was standing in the front room looking frightened. The detective understood why Greg might be upset, but he didn't want to jump to any conclusions. Now, it was clear Greg's girlfriend had not been home when Greg got there, but besides that, the police didn't have a whole lot of information about what was even going on here. And so Goff introduced himself to Greg and asked him when was the last time he spoke to his girlfriend. Greg said that he had seen Jo a couple days earlier before he left town, but he hadn't talked to her since. Goff asked if it was odd that he would go 2 full days without speaking to his girlfriend. But Greg just shook his head and said no. He'd been busy while he was gone, and he figured Jo had been busy too, getting ready for Christmas, so that's why he must have missed her when he'd called. While Goff listened to Greg, he scanned the room. He could see Jo's coat, boots, and purse. Just like Greg, he did think it was strange that Jo would go out and leave all of those things behind. But still, this didn't prove a crime had occurred here. Goff also noticed 2 cider bottles sitting on a small table. One had a couple of sips gone, and the other looked untouched. Goff asked Greg if there was anything about Jo, like physical attributes or places she liked to frequent, that might point police in the right direction as they began this search for her. Greg gave a basic description of Jo. He said she was average height, had short blonde hair, and blue eyes. And he said she'd been hanging out with coworkers the night he left town at a pub called the Bristol Ram. Goff jotted all of this down in his notebook, got details of where Greg had spent the weekend, and then joined a couple of officers in the kitchen. After spending a few hours in the flat, Goff and the other officers had not found anything that stood out to them. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of a struggle, and at least according to Greg, the front door had been locked when he got home. Goff told his team to speak to the landlord who lived upstairs, and also to Jo's other neighbors, to see if anyone had seen her in the last couple of days. For now, Goff was treating this as a missing persons case that he hoped would have a clear explanation and a happy ending. For all he knew, Jo had just left town without telling her boyfriend. Maybe she was with the person she'd gotten one of those ciders for. And maybe she took a different coat and purse with her and accidentally forgot her phone. I mean, it was just a thought, but either way, Goff felt confident he could retrace Jo's steps from the moment she left the pub and he could find her. Later that day, Goff sat at the station poring over CCTV surveillance footage from locations between the Bristol Ram pub and Jo's flat. Britain has more surveillance cameras per person than almost any other country in the world. This is why Goff felt so confident he'd be able to see exactly where Jo had gone on the last night anybody had heard from her. And he would be right. Using footage from storefront and street cameras, Goff followed Jo's walk out of the pub and through Bristol. Footage from inside the convenience store showed her buying the pizza, and he saw her go into Bargain Booze and walk out with 2 bottles of cider. Goff later picked her up on a street camera in her neighborhood that showed her walking towards her flat. So, it looked like Jo had just gone home after going to the pub. And Goff could see she was wearing the coat and carrying the purse that had been found inside of her flat. However, Goff couldn't find any surveillance footage that showed Jo back on the street after she had gotten home. It was like she had gone inside of her flat and then just vanished. And when the entire day went by without any of Jo's friends or family hearing from her, Goff began to think that Jo very likely did not just ditch her boyfriend and leave town. And so Goff went to meet with Jo's parents, and when he did, he suggested they reach out to the press for some help. On December 21st, 2 days after Greg had reported Jo missing, Jo's parents went on the local news. They said they loved their daughter dearly, and they asked anyone who might have helpful information to please come forward. By the following day, Joe's story had hit the major newspapers in London, and her picture was being shown on TV news programs all throughout the United Kingdom. And soon, the story of the pretty young missing woman had become a public obsession. At 9 a.m. on Christmas morning, so over a week after Joe had gone missing, a couple was walking their dog down a snow-covered street that was about 3 miles away from Joe's flat. All of a sudden, the dog stopped, sniffed the air, and then looked over to the side of the road. The couple glanced in the direction the dog was staring, but all they could see was a stone wall standing several feet high that separated the road they were on from a field filled with trees on the other side. The man tugged on his dog's leash to try to get the dog moving, but his wife told him to actually stop, and then she walked over to the wall and knelt down to see what was there. And when she looked, she saw something bright buried beneath the snow and a pile of leaves. And as she leaned in closer, she screamed. A few minutes later, several police cars came to a stop on the road where the couple and the dog were waiting. Goff got out of his car and walked right past the couple towards that wall. On the ground, he could see part of a brightly colored t-shirt and a frozen blue human arm. Goff put on his gloves, and he was quickly joined by several forensics officers. And together, they carefully dug into the snow and leaves until they revealed the frozen dead body of a young woman. As soon as he saw her, Goff closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He really was almost always unflappable, but seeing something like this, on Christmas of all days, just shattered him. Goff walked away from the body, collected himself, and then he called Joe's parents to tell them he believed he had just found their daughter's body. Later that morning, after the body had been positively identified as Joe's, Goff and several forensics officers stood by the wall, staring down at Joe. Goff wondered if maybe this was just a terrible accident. Maybe Joe had left her flat in a rush without her coat on, slipped on the snowy ground, and suffered some sort of injury that killed her, or that immobilized her and then she died of exposure. And because it had been snowing, her body would have quickly been covered and would have gone unnoticed. As Goff crouched down and searched the area around Joe's body, a few pieces of evidence jumped out at him. Joe was clothed, however, her shirt had been pulled up around her neck, exposing one of her breasts. He also saw bruising on her throat. And so right away, this did not seem like something that would happen from a fall. It looked like something that would happen in a sexual assault. Also, Goff noticed that Joe had on only one sock. But more specifically, he saw the bottom of her bare foot and the bottom of the sock on the other foot were totally clean. There was no dirt, no leaves, or any other sign that she'd been walking around in this area. It was like she'd been dropped here. Goff heard somebody call his name, and he turned to see a forensic biologist crouched down looking at the wall nearby, gesturing to him. Goff joined her, and she immediately pointed to a section of the wall. Goff looked, and he saw there were bloodstains running vertically up this one section of the wall, almost from the very top to the bottom. He looked at the forensic biologist, a bit confused. She told him that these stains were not the kind of blood spatter that would occur from an attack. Instead, these were stains that would have been left when someone tried to lift Joe's bloody body over the wall and failed. Goff stood up and peered over the wall. On the other side was just a big field full of trees. Had someone been able to actually dump Joe's body onto the other side of the wall, meaning had they not failed to get her over, there was no telling how long it would have taken for someone to finally find her. Goff exhaled, and he could see his breath hanging in the air. The way Joe's body had been found, and the bloodstain on the wall, made it pretty clear this was no accident. He now had a murder investigation on his hands. Goff also felt sure that Joe had not been walking along this road when she died. So his first thought was that she'd been murdered somewhere else, probably near her flat, and then driven and dumped here. Goff knew the forensics team had a lot of work to do. However, they seemed very optimistic that the snow and the low temperatures had helped preserve the body. and so they hoped they'd be able to find blood or other DNA samples that might lead them to Joe's killer. So Goff left them to it, got in his car, and headed back to the station. Now that he was investigating a murder, he knew where he had to start, with Joe's boyfriend, Greg. That night, so Christmas night, Goff sat across from Greg inside of an interview room, and the young man looked like a total wreck. He told Goff this was supposed to be the first Christmas he and Joe were going to spend together, and he couldn't believe this was happening. However, as upset as Greg was, he was very cooperative throughout the interview. He gave Goff all the details of his weekend trip again, he again told the story of what had happened when he first came home, and he agreed to submit DNA samples. After that, Goff let Greg go. Since Greg was the victim's boyfriend, the detective would not completely cross him off the suspect list. However, Goff had already followed up on Greg's alibi after they met that first time, and it had checked out. Also, because there was no surveillance footage of Joe after she had gone inside of her flat and then disappeared, Goff believed the only person who could have carried out this murder would be somebody who lived basically inside of that building that the flat was in, because that's the only way they would escape being seen on camera going in and out of her place. And because this case was now all over the news, lots of other people in the United Kingdom were beginning to speculate the same thing. The killer must have been inside of that building when Joe went into her flat. But before Goff could even decide what to do about this theory, he got a phone call. On the other end of the line, he heard the sound of an older man's voice who was speaking with a very proper, posh English accent, and this man quickly introduced himself as Chris Jeffries, Joe and Greg's landlord and upstairs neighbor. And Chris told Goff that he had seen the news about the discovery of Joe's body, and he believed he had information that would help. He said on the night Joe went missing, he had seen a few people he did not recognize walking along the side of the house. In the days following this phone call, Goff followed up on the details of Chris's story, and the detective got the feeling that the landlord was not telling him the whole truth. The landlord, Chris, had been aware of the investigation since the moment police showed up after the 999 call. In fact, members of Goff's investigative team had taken a statement from Chris because he owned the building Joe lived in and was her upstairs neighbor. Now it struck Goff that during that initial meeting, Chris had not mentioned these strangers he'd supposedly seen near the house. Chris had also told investigators that on the night Joe went missing, he said he'd spent the entire night at home. However, since that initial conversation, Goff had reviewed additional surveillance footage. And late on the night of December 17th, the last night anyone had seen Joe alive, Goff saw a car on that footage that looked a lot like Chris's car driving across a nearby suspension bridge, indicating he had not been home the whole time. So, on December 30th, 5 days after Joe's body was discovered, Goff met Chris at the police station and escorted him directly to an interview room. Chris had long white hair, and he wore a sports coat and carried this small leather satchel. He sort of looked like an eccentric professor. Goff sat down at a small table across from Chris and asked him how his relationship with Joe had been. Did he have any issues with her? But Chris just shook his head. He said Joe and Greg were a nice couple and good tenants. He said the worst he could say about them was that sometimes their cat got out and found its way upstairs to his place. Goff asked Chris what he'd been doing on the night of December 17th, the night that Joe went missing. Chris immediately looked confused. He said he'd been home the whole night and hadn't seen anything unusual, just like he'd already told police. Now, Goff didn't raise his voice or even change his facial expression, but he said to Chris, "Hey, that's not true." Chris had called and said on the phone that he had noticed some unusual strangers walking by the house. And so he asked Chris, why hadn't he told the police about those people when they first spoke to him? Now, a worried look came across Chris's face. He said he had only come here to help, but now it felt like he was being accused of something. But Goff just asked him again, why hadn't he told the police about the people he saw by the house? Chris kind of shook it off. He said it was the holidays and people in the neighborhood were having parties, so it didn't seem strange to him at the time that people were walking by the house. For a minute, there was just silence between the two men. And then Goff finally said, On December 17th, surveillance cameras had caught a car that looked just like Chris's car driving across the suspension bridge that was the main route between Joe's flat and the location where her body was found. Chris looked totally stunned. He said there had to be a mistake. He never left his flat that night. It was too dangerous, it was snowing and the roads were bad, so he didn't want to leave his house. At this point, Goff just excused himself and walked out of the room. In all honesty, he really didn't know if Chris was guilty. Chris had easy access to Joe's flat, and that car on the surveillance footage could possibly be his. This was just too much to ignore, and so Goff needed a bit more time to fully dig into Chris's background and his seemingly flimsy alibi. Under British law, in the case of serious crimes like murder, police can apply to a magistrate to hold potential suspects for 36 hours without charging them. Goff felt confident a magistrate would allow him to hold Chris. And Goff was right. That night, police arrested Chris, took a DNA sample, and transferred him to a jail cell in a nearby facility. And for the first time, Goff felt like he had a legitimate suspect. The following morning, which was New Year's Eve, Goff sat at his desk staring at the front pages of multiple tabloid newspapers. Goff was very annoyed, because despite all of his team's efforts to hide it, news about Chris's arrest had gotten out. Goff flipped open one of the papers, and as soon as he did, he got even more upset. The paper had basically decided that Chris had murdered Joe. It was not just that he was arrested, but no, he was the killer. And their proof? Well, just how he looked and how he spoke. However, as upset as Goff was about this, the tabloid headlines actually ended up benefiting his investigation. Because that morning, while Goff waited to secure a search warrant for Chris's flat, he got a phone call. This caller said his name was Vincent Tabak, and he lived in the building right next to Joe's that also happened to be owned by Chris. Vincent said he had seen Chris's car earlier that night facing one direction, and the following morning, Chris's car was facing the opposite direction. When Goff heard this, he started to get excited. If he could prove Chris was lying about staying home on the night Joe went missing, he might be able to definitively link Chris's car to the one he'd seen on the suspension bridge in the surveillance footage. After Goff hung up, he immediately asked a detective on his team to follow up with Vincent to see if he might have seen or heard anything else that night. And then soon after that, Goff got the approval for his search warrant, and so he and his team headed over to Chris's upstairs flat. It was New Year's Eve, and as Goff drove across town, he believed he might actually be able to close this case before people all across the country popped open champagne bottles and welcomed in 2011. When Goff and his team walked inside of Chris's upstairs flat, it felt like they'd stepped into a library. The walls were lined with shelves that were overflowing with old books. Goff told his team to split up and begin their search, and it didn't take long before one of them called out from the kitchen. And so Goff and the other officers walked into the kitchen, and they found that officer sitting on the floor holding something that he'd found tucked under one of the kitchen cabinets. When Goff bent down to get a better look, he thought he was looking at the smoking gun that would wrap this case up, because the officer on the floor was holding a pair of trainers, the British word for tennis shoes, and one of these trainers looked like it was stained with blood. Even the normally calm and collected Goff could not hide his excitement. Between this shoe, the call from the next-door neighbor, and the surveillance footage from the bridge, Goff felt like he was close to having enough evidence to build a strong case against Chris. And so officers bagged the trainer and had it sent off to the crime lab for expedited testing. And by the following day, which was New Year's Day of 2011, the lab came back with the test results. And on the same day, the lab also reported that they had run tests on DNA samples they'd found on Joe's clothes and skin. And when all these test results came in, Goff knew that they had found Joe's killer. Based on DNA evidence, surveillance footage, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is what police believe happened to Joe Yates on the night of December 17, 2010. Around 8:45 p.m., the killer stood outside of Joe's front door holding her cat. The killer clutched the cat close to their chest so it wouldn't dart off, and then knocked on Joe's door. Joe opened the door, saw the cat, and immediately smiled. She apologized for the cat's behavior and thanked the killer for bringing her cat back. The killer said it was no problem, leaned in through her door and put the cat down, and as the cat trotted off towards Joe's kitchen, the killer lunged at Joe, pushed her further into the front room, and slammed the door behind them. Joe screamed, but the killer immediately covered her mouth while they shoved her through the flat towards the bedroom. Joe tried to fight back, but it was happening so quickly, and the killer threw her onto the bed, pulled her shirt up around her neck, and grabbed at her chest. Joe struggled and one of her socks fell off in the fight. The killer tried to keep her pinned down, but Joe let out this loud scream, desperately hoping somebody would hear her and save her. The killer panicked and punched her in the face. Blood ran down Joe's cheeks. Then the killer just wrapped their hands around Joe's throat and squeezed. They sat on top of Joe, strangling her violently for over 20 seconds until Joe stopped breathing and died. The killer got off the bed and walked to the front room. They could hear the cat walking around in the kitchen, but other than that, there wasn't any noise coming from the outside. The killer took a steadying breath, hoping they had somehow managed to keep Joe quiet enough to not get detected. And so the killer just sort of stood there for a long time, listening and planning their next move. About an hour after the killer had arrived at Joe's, they went back into the bedroom, picked up Joe, and carried her to the front door. With Joe in their arms, the killer opened the door, quickly locked it from the inside, then they stepped outside and closed the door behind them. Then they rushed to their car, opened up the trunk, and dropped Joe's body inside. Then the killer got in their car and sped across town in the snow. When they reached a dark, empty road with a wall running alongside it, they pulled over and got out. They scanned the street and saw nobody was nearby, so they carefully opened up the trunk, picked Joe up, and carried her over to the side of the road near the wall. The killer tried to lift Joe's body over the wall, but they just couldn't do it. She was too heavy. And so her body slid down the wall, leaving bloodstains on the wall from her face and neck. Finally, the killer just dropped Joe onto the snowy ground. They piled more snow and leaves on top of her, and then ran back to their car and drove off. A few minutes later, they stepped back inside of their flat, hoping nobody had seen what they just did. Despite what some people in the media had already decided, Joe's landlord, Chris Jeffries, had nothing to do with Joe's murder. It would turn out Joe's next-door neighbor, Vincent Tabak, had killed her. Vincent was the one who had called police to say he believed that Chris, who also happened to be his landlord, had driven off in his car on the night Joe was killed, that he was lying about being in his flat the whole time. Vincent had called police after reading about Chris's arrest in the tabloid newspapers. He thought it was a great opportunity to distance himself from the crime and solidify the police's belief that Chris was the killer. Now, when Goff spoke to Vincent, he learned that Vincent was in the Netherlands celebrating Christmas, meaning he was not home. Now, this didn't mean he was guilty, but it struck Goff as just a little bit suspicious, and so he wanted to follow up with Vincent. So Goff contacted authorities in the Netherlands, and then Goff sent a detective from his team out to the Netherlands to meet with Vincent in person. Now, the interview itself did not provide any new information. However, the detective was able to get Vincent to submit a DNA sample. When the test results for the trainers that had been found in Chris's flat came in from the crime lab, it would turn out that even though there might have been blood on them, there was no connection to the murder at all. However, the DNA samples taken from Joe's body and clothes that the crime lab had just tested as well did match the sample that Vincent had provided. After these results, Goff went back to the surveillance footage of the suspension bridge that was near the road where Joe's body had been found. The car in that footage was not Chris's after all, and police would soon discover that Vincent had taken a different, less direct route to the road, which is why he was never seen on camera. Goff secured a warrant, and he and his team searched Vincent's apartment. While they didn't find any specific evidence pertaining to the crime there, Vincent had been watching violent pornography on his computer most of which featured men assaulting women and strangling them. After police arrested Vincent, they would learn that he didn't really have any real relationship with Jo. He had just seen her around the neighborhood and thought she was pretty. He had also brought her cat back to her in the past. But over time, Vincent developed a violent obsession with Jo. He wanted to have sex with her and strangle her. And as Christmas of 2010 approached, Vincent decided he didn't want to wait any longer to act on this obsession. And when he saw Jo's cat outside on December 17th, he saw his opportunity. Vincent showed up at Jo's flat, returned her cat, and then killed her. Vincent was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 20 years. As for Jo's landlord, Chris Jeffries, who was all but proclaimed guilty in much of the UK media, he's spoken at length in interviews, telling his side of the story and saying how all he had wanted to do was help the police solve a horrible crime.
Where the silver winds curl through the pines, and the valley hums with forgotten lines. You walk with a lantern shaped by storms, a quiet flame in the dusk that warms. Your footsteps glow on the trembling ground, turning the night to a softer sound. Even when shadows rise like waves, you shine the path the darkness craves.
A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen's podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted.